Okay. All right, here we go. Now for real. Thank you all for bearing with me. Hi, everyone. My name is Gina Chung, and I'm the programs director here at Kundiman. If this is your first time joining Kundiman for an event, welcome. Kundiman is a literary nonprofit dedicated to nurturing writers and readers of Asian American literature. Kundiman creates a space where Asian Americans can explore, through art, the unique challenges that face the new and ever-changing diaspora. We see the arts as a tool of empowerment, of education and liberation, and of addressing proactively the legacy that we will leave for our future. Through readings, online classes, and our retreat, we seek to uplift writers of color and the storytellers of our communities. Today, we're very excited to present this special panel, A Guide for Writers on the Road to Publication, which has been generously sponsored by Penguin Random House. Today, we're joined by four amazing agents and editors from the spheres of book and literary magazine publishing. We appreciate all of you so much for being here, and we're grateful to be sharing this space where we can discuss publishing while also dispensing pockets of knowledge within our community. Some brief housekeeping notes before we get started. You can turn on subtitles by going to the bottom of your screen where it says show subtitles. Thank you so much to Sign Nexus for providing live captioning for us today. And thank you to Pro Bono ASL for providing ASL access. We are also recording this panel, and this video will be sent to all registered participants afterwards. I'm going to begin by introducing each of our panelists, and then we'll go into a moderated conversation until around 7:40 p.m. Eastern, and then we will go into audience Q&A. Please submit your questions via the Q&A box rather than in the chat, as we don't want to lose track of your questions, and that's the best way to submit them, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible. All right, now without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Neela Banerjee is the managing editor of Kaya Press, where she recently launched a South Asian diasporic imprint called Kulhar Books. She teaches Asian American literature, creative writing, and publishing at UCLA, Loyola Marymount University, and USC in Los Angeles. Her writing has appeared widely in places like World Literature Today, Harper's Bazaar, the Texas Observer, and Alta Journal. Marie Pantojan is an executive editor at Random House, where she publishes both nonfiction and literary fiction. She has published New York Times and national bestsellers, as well as winners and finalists for the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, the Mark Linton History Prize, the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Carol Shields Prize for Fiction, and many others. She was a 2023 PW Star Watch honoree and is a longtime mentor with the Representation Matters program. Anjali Singh has been a literary agent since 2015 and founded her own agency in 2024. In her 30 years of publishing, she has worked as an international literary scout, an acquiring editor at Vintage Books, at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, Simon & Schuster, and as editorial director of Other Press. She has always been drawn to the thrill of discovering new writers, but also lately has found joy in helping to relaunch writers mid-career. And she focuses on literary fiction, memoir, and narrative nonfiction, as well as graphic novels for all ages. Mimi Wong is a writer, editor, and educator. Her fiction and nonfiction have been published in Joyland, The Believer, Electric Literature, The Margins, and was anthologized in Best Letters from Asian Americans in the Arts. For her work engaging with Asian diasporic art and culture, she was awarded the Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant. Passionate about building a more inclusive literary community, she was previously editor-in-chief of The Offing, which won a Whiting Literary Magazine Prize, and continues to serve as a board member. She has taught literature at Barnard College and currently teaches writing at the New School, and she lives in New York. Thank you all so much for being here. All right, so let's jump into our conversation. So since there's many of us, I'm just kind of going to throw it to different panelists. But if you feel like chiming in on any of the questions, feel free to unmute yourself and jump on in. All right. So to begin, this panel is titled, A Guide for Writers on the Road to Publication. And for many writers, oftentimes that starts with starting to submit their work to literary magazines and to journals. So Mimi, I'm going to throw this first question to you. Why should I consider submitting my work to journals and magazines? And what role do literary magazines and journals play in helping a writer establish their career?
Yes. Ooh, I could talk a long time about this question. I mean, I think first to sort of dispel the idea of the road being very straight. I think often the road to publication can be very winding, very circular. And so I think given that, I think um, literary journals and magazines can kind of, play a role like alongside that very winding path that you might be on. So I think, conventional wisdom is maybe you're starting out as a writer, you're kind of testing your voice, you're experimenting with form, genres that you're publishing in, and I think maybe at this stage, if you had people read your work and you've edited it yourself and feel like it might be ready to share with someone at a more professional level, then this might be a good stage to start submitting to journals and kind of getting some sort of response. But I also think, publishing in literary journals and magazines is a way to also feel like you're actively participating in the literary community. I know writers often feel like, writing can be very isolating or it can be a lonely experience. But I think a way to sort of feel like you're part of a community is to start participating, start submitting your work, maybe also start volunteering for literary journals. I know journals are always looking for volunteer readers. So I think this is like a great sort of entry point if you're sort of like looking for your place, in the literary space.
Yeah, I love that point too that you just brought up about volunteering and being part of like the sort of reading process. That's something I often recommend to students as well. I think also whenever I've been a reader for a magazine or a contest or anything, it also helps to make the whole process feel a little bit less personal. Because the other thing that writers often deal with is rejection. It's just part of the writing process. So in addition to getting familiar with the literary landscape, what are some things that writers should know before they start that process of submitting their work to literary magazines?
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, one thing, to tell yourself is you can take your time. Don't feel like you have to like really rush through this process. I think take your time with your work, really polishing it, getting some trusted people to look over your work before you start sending it out there. And also, I think really doing your research before you are just kind of sending it out to the world. For me, I think it's really important to be actively reading a lot of these journals, and if you're, just feeling lost about where to even begin, I think looking around at writers you admire, especially seeing like maybe where they published a little bit earlier in their career. If you are lucky enough to participate in any writing workshops or you go to conferences, retreats, and you're meeting other writers sort of at your level, I always love talking to people about where they've had good experiences, publishing or working with editors. So I think getting a sense for different journals, different tastes, where it might align with what you're working on. I think that's a good way to kind of start and figure out, where might be a good fit for your work.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point about like thinking about the landscape and the community aspect too of being a writer. I think that has a lot to do with what you just said. So, I'm actually curious, and this is a question that's kind of open to anyone on this panel, but are there any specific, literary events, organizations, and or journals or other opportunities that you would recommend for AAPI writers specifically, given the topic of this panel?
I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in, but I guess, I think Kundiman, obviously a great resource. I'm also thinking about, the Asian American Writers Workshop, and they have the Margins, which, is a journal that I love to read. I think there's also a lot of really great literary journals now that are, if not exclusively edited by writers of color, have a lot of writers of color on their masthead. And so I always advise checking out the masthead before you submit your work and really targeting like editors that you want to work with. A lot of these editors who are editing these literary magazines and journals are they're writers they're writers themselves. They're also working on stuff, so finding people that you kind of like want to sort of have that sort of like almost like mentorship with as you're, who are going to be reading your work. I think that can be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Neela, do you have anything to add to this, maybe?
I mean, I think, everything that I second everything that Mimi said. The offing where Mimi was before is I always send my students there because they're really open to, BIPOC, Asian American voices. Um, I also just, I mean, I love all of the those things that are out there now to help you kind of sort through stuff. Chill Subs is somewhere I always send people who are looking for stuff because I find their voice and they've just kind of like they're so charming in the way they bring together all of these different calls for publication. So I think there's seems to be once you start looking at that, I mean, from Poets and Writers, that's been around for a long time, obviously. And, if you want to look at like a big list to going to these smaller places, Chill Subs sends out like, themed calls a lot in their social media. They're doing a lot of great stuff. There's a Substack that I follow that used to be that was run by somebody. I think it's called like the Lip. It used to be called like the Lip Mag. I think that's what the Substack is called too. I'll look it up real quick while I'm on here. And I find that they're so useful. There's all these conversations in that Substack about really useful things that I don't know, like, oh, which journals and magazines out there are actually scams, or like what's trending, what are people thinking about, you know, I think it is, for me, I think the literary magazine world is such a place for really kind of being in community and knowing what's on, going to the Brooklyn Book Festival if you're in New York, or any other conferences where there's book fairs. I think that's my favorite way to really see what's happening because you can actually see, even if the magazine is online, kind of talk to the people, see what their vibe is, what their personalities are like. I definitely do the thing where if there's a writer that when I was first starting writing and publishing, I like went to Roxane Gay's website and was like, oh, I really like Roxane's writing, and she would publish so much that I just followed and looked up and made my lists from there. I think anyone who's putting their stuff out there, it's definitely about surveying and then, finding your list, which is, who's publishing in it, who are the editors, what is there a story that I came across that I liked, and kind of creating your own spreadsheet and going from there, I think is really, it's such a personal thing, but being able to go and pick up a bunch of magazines or swag from different literary journals, I think is so fun and such a great way to be like, oh, I talked to somebody there and like we seem to, and have a lot in common. And I think that kind of like, oh, meeting editors, you're not like coming in with a hard pitch at like the Brooklyn Book Festival. You're just, ask them what their favorite story in the journal was, or what their favorite poem was, or, I think it can really, trying to understand what they're looking for is so important.
Yeah, I love that you brought in so many different types of platforms, like both online and in person, which I think increasingly we're all like craving that even more nowadays. So yeah, that's a really great point. So I think some tools and platforms you mentioned are, different Substacks for writers that you might follow. Let's see. Chill Subs is a great one. And I think just in general, kind of familiarizing yourself by like diving into writers that you love and where they've been published is a really great move. Um, our next question, I'm going to throw this one to you, Anjali. Is it essential to have published in literary journals prior to querying or thinking about publishing your first book?
No, I don't think it's essential. There are very few publications that like really move the needle if you're trying to land in a big five publishing house. Like it really truly is and has always been the New Yorker or the Paris Review that will make an editor sit up. The other ones are nice to have for all the reasons that Neela and Mimi have pointed out, which is when you're thinking about taking on a writer as an editor or as an agent, you want to know that they're kind of enmeshed in the literary community. You kind of want to know that they have a sense of like where they fit in the literary landscape, but also that they already have fans out there. And so sometimes publishing in literary magazines is a way of demonstrating that, but also, as Mimi said, on this long winding path, often to book publication, um, you're building your community along the way, and you're finding your sort of literary fans and people who are going to tell their friends about you and continue to support your career. It's like you're making the building blocks of your career by doing that. But I also don't think because it also depends on what you're writing, what space it fits into. I don't think it's necessary. Like I'm not going to look at a query letter if it doesn't list publications, even for a short story collection. It's not necessary. But I think in terms of that journey and trying to figure out your space, all the things that Mimi and Neela said, I would say too about choosing an agent, right? Like figure out who they are, what they're interested in, kind of have a good story to tell about yourself, but also be really curious about them because that's sort of the way you're going to find the right match.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Marie, I'm curious to get your take on this as someone who's working within a publishing house and is typically someone who's seeing something that's maybe a little bit more polished. So yeah, I would love to get your take.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think my take aligns really closely to what Anjali just said, where first it does really depend on the category that you're publishing in. Um, and even if, like you're submitting something that's like poetry or literary fiction or short story collection, ones that one might typically expect to have seen the writer gone through the lit mag route first. Um, I I feel like previous publications in lit magazines do signal a kind of work behind the scenes that has happened before my being introduced to the writer, and that helps. I think like that does help me evaluate the submission. It helps me kind of understand in a kind of shortcut way, like what community this writer is coming from, what kind of support they might be able to call on when we're going through the publication process, like what blurbs can we go to? Like what potential writers can we go to for blurbs, for instance? What writers can we go to for conversation partners, for launch events? Like all of that kind of networking that comes with like the campaign for a book. But again, like I think it's not absolutely necessary. I know I've acquired writers who did not publish at Lit Mags before they got to a book. So it's additive, but it's not the only thing.
Thank you all so much. The next question, I think, talks now about that step that I think a lot of writers are really curious about, which is that of querying an agent. Um, so I'm going to throw it to you, Anjali. Could you tell us what is the role of an agent, and at what point should a writer really start thinking about finding an agent?
Oh, okay. So my most basic job is to pair an author with a book publisher, right? But one thing I always like to unpack for writers is agents are, for the most part, unless they're sort of part of a more corporate machine, like the William Morris that I say, but we're all working on commission, right? And so there's always a money piece that is a part of our calculations in terms of how we're going to invest our time. I think it's really important because back to this question of rejection, writers get rejected all the time. Writers get rejected by agents all the time. Agents get rejected by editors all the time. Editors get, turned down by their publisher, right? Like it requires a lot of passion to want to champion a project. And so there's this Venn diagram of how passionate am I about this project and how much time is it going to take and where is it likely to land. And if it's likely to land in a small press space, then the passion has to be really high because the money is going to be very low. And so sometimes a project lands in my inbox that I think is really, really, really good. It's just not something I personally care enough about to want to go down a road of finding out a place in at a smaller press. Um, but so the role of the agent, which was the first question, is in many ways we're trying to match authors with the big five. Like that's kind of my primary goal, or when I work with graphic novelists, for example, there's so many wonderful graphic novelists and they can be published in a graphic novel space. So I feel like one of my jobs is to be that bridge of like, is this a book that can go from a comic space and be positioned in a mainstream trade space? Because that's the space that I know well. And I also like to say there's so many different spaces, as Neela and Mimi represent, like so many different spaces within publishing. So agents kind of work in that most commercial space. I always say I work at the margins of a very commercial industry, and I am limited in my resources. What I take on, I am doing entirely on spec until there's a book deal. And then how much I sell the book for is going to determine how much I'm paid for the work. So I do the same amount of work for a book that is sold to a small press or sold to a big press. Um, and so at what point you should come to me is in a way when you know what space you're kind of fitting into. And um, whether or not your book is sort of destined for the big five. Like if that's a really, really important value to you, because it isn't the most important value and it is actually not the best place for a lot of projects. Um, and a lot of careers start in more intentional, smaller spaces and establish that they have a readership and platform and then move over to the big five. And you don't always need an agent for those early, even book publication, that early part of that journey. Um, and the other thing I'd say about when you approach an agent is truly, 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 when you have a project that feels, well, it depends, right? You can meet an agent in person at a conference, and the relationship starts in a really different way. And in which case, you don't have to be like a completely fully formed, like everything is done. But when you're querying me blind, we don't have a relationship, there isn't somebody who's putting us in touch, then the bar is higher for the project to be pretty much complete. And if it's a novel, a book that you have done everything you possibly could on your own with it. You have um, had many, many, many people in your life read it. You ideally have some kind of writing group that you're a part of that has workshopped the book with you. But it really should be a finished book. You can't create an agent and be like, oh, okay, I'll come back to you in 8 months when it's finished for fiction. Novels have to be done and novels have to be done to sell. Um, this is if you haven't published before, the rules changed a little bit if you're already established. And then for nonfiction projects, agents sell those projects on proposal. So for nonfiction, it's much more dependent on your platform in the world. Why this book, why now, and why this person are kind of the three big questions that we ask as agents and then have to establish as part of the sales pitch to editors. So you need to have a very clear story about why you're the perfect person to write your book, and ideally have done a book proposal, I think, by the time you query an agent. But you don't always have to have that manuscript. And like you don't always have to have anything written. It really depends on how big your platform is before you kind of begin that conversation with an agent, if that makes sense. I think I'll stop there because I've been talking a long time.
That is such a comprehensive answer. Thank you. I think you've answered like three, four different questions that I was also thinking that I was already thinking of. So that's great. So you mentioned, the sort of money piece of publishing, which I think is a thing that is often opaque to people outside of it. And the fact that not everyone, needs an agent necessarily. For this next question, I'm curious how, if a writer has a work that's say like kind of more hybrid or multi-genre or, otherwise falls outside of traditional parameters of genre. How should writers of those kinds of projects approach that process? And Neela, I'm wondering if I can throw this question to you.
Yes. I think, at Kaya Press, we are really interested in um, non-traditional projects and hybrid projects. We really, are here to be a champion of those kinds of projects, and we are now, even though Kaya started in New York, we're now based in Los Angeles. We're kind of just functioning outside of the traditional publishing industry in that way. So we're really interested in those projects. And I think a lot of the writers that come to us who are maybe, come because they haven't quite found success in the traditional mainstream industry. And that can be, I mean, and I think as Anjali was saying, it's unfortunate that there are those strictures around, what is considered commercial or not, right? That is such a crapshoot. It's so hard to say. But for us, and I can just give specific examples. We had our writer Mimi Locke, who had a short story collection called Last of Her Name, and it was, she's Chinese. She grew up in the UK and spent a lot of time in Hong Kong. So the stories were really global. They were not Asian American stories. They were very international stories. And one of the stories was a novella. It was a long story. So this is back in like 2018, 2017, 18. And she queried many agents and tried to get an agent. And they said, we don't know how to sell this book. We don't know the right editors who would take it. It's kind of, it's not fitting into these boxes of Asian American or, this kind of story. It has this like fabulous novella in the middle of it, which was published in McSweeney, speaking of, getting publications. So she really felt like she didn't know what to do. So she had taken the stories, she wasn't sure how to try to market it. And she came to us. I'd actually gone to graduate school. I got my MFA with her. So she approached me and was like, would Kaya be interested in this? And we read it. We have an editorial board. And we really, felt like the stories were ready. We still worked on them with her and we published it, and it went on to win the Penn, debut short story prize. And now she has a really big agent. So, I think it works in multiple ways. And we're so excited at Kaya to work in that way. Another writer who came to us kind of non-traditionally was a writer named Annalise Chen, who was, in kind of at the top of when autofiction novels, kind of autobiography novel hybrids were really coming big about 10, 15 years ago. And she was actually had an agent and was working. That was when Amazon still had their kind of literary press. She was working with an editor there, but he left and she didn't kind of feel comfortable keeping the book there. So she wanted to find a new press that really understood her project, kind of came to us. And we published that book. It's really popular. From that book, she got like the National Book Foundation's 5 Under 35. And then again, she went on to get an agent that is really pushing her work. And her second memoir just came out to much acclaim. So I think it's really, I think small presses, I definitely think Kaya is one of the only presses that we really see ourselves as obviously Asian Pacific American, but also Asian diasporic, where I'm so excited to hold that space for people who have different books. I think a couple of years ago, I had a writer. She wrote a really interesting hybrid memoir. It has photographs. It has like multiple points of view called Accomplice to Memory. This kind of about her father's story. And she knew she was writing it this way that was very hybrid. So she did such specific research, like which books are similar to mine, who published them, how did they do? And so she told me, and we've been on panels together talking about it, she had narrowed it down to like 2 presses, and I think that if you do have a work that is non-traditional in some way, what is it about the book that you're looking at? Obviously so much of the publishing industry works on titles that are similar to yours. So again, finding a book that, even if it's not similar in background or genre, but like in some of the ways that the book is moving in the world, and finding out the publication path, the agent, the editors who worked on that is really useful.
Thank you so much for sharing those stories, Neela. And so much, like I was nodding along vigorously to so many of the writers you mentioned, just because I'm such a fan of their work and the many of those books that you mentioned that were published sort of outside of traditional means. Um, the next question that I wanted to ask was, so I think along with a lot of sort of the opacity of like, the ins and outs of publishing, I think there's often also a sense that, oh, I have to be a certain age, like, you mentioned 535, like there's this idea that you need to be say, younger, or you need to be living in the United States in order to obtain an agent or to publish a book here, or to have a book that, reaches any kind of audience. I'm curious how one might go about the querying process, if that's different at all, or maybe we can broaden the question to if you are someone who's maybe outside of these kind of like narrow parameters of what I think a lot of people think you have to be a writer. What advice would you give to someone like that? And Anjali, I'm going to throw that to you first.
Sure. Well, um, first I want to say that I sold a book this fall by a writer who's 76. And she had published her first novel like 20 years ago. She's an African American woman who lives in London. And she published a novel in 2004. And then this book was her second novel and sat in a drawer for 5 years. And then she read an interview with like the PW had done about like it was a diversity in publishing thing, and she found me and she wrote to me, and it was yes, it was like a very beautiful story. And then I took it on knowing that it wouldn't be easy, but that's sort of what I enjoy. And I love the book. I mean, I just really, really love the book. And we just sold it to an editor who really, really, really loved the book. And I do think the fact that she's 76 or she'll be 78 by the time the book comes out will be part of the story that they're able to tell around the book. So it isn't always an impediment. And it wasn't that she was that age that actually made me worry about selling the book. It was the kind of combined, it was a very, very long book. It was an author who wasn't based in the US. It's a very American, it's a very international story, actually, but American in many ways too, because she's a Black woman. So it's not like the UK is like, oh my God, you're based here. We see how this book relates to us. And I think that that was one of the challenges of the first book that Neela mentioned, is that American publishing, at least the most commercial aspects of it, are sitting there going, always, yeah, who's the audience going to be? Who's the audience going to be? And they have a really hard time holding something when there isn't an actual connection. If the writer um, isn't based here, right, with a literary platform or literary community, or if they are based here, that helps if they're trying to write about something that feels more international. But yeah, there's an absolute like prejudice against stories that aren't American. And I'm sure Marie can speak to that because Marie's also, I like to publish or represent writers who are international. And I think Marie also is really drawn to those kinds of stories. But yeah, I think, I don't even remember the question at this point. Oh, is it a challenge? Yeah. How do you overcome that challenge? I think it's really always about trying to figure out a story that you can tell about yourself, and at the same time, constantly doing your research to find the spaces, the people within the industry, and the cultural spaces like Acaia Press within the industry that actually have, yeah, have a culture that is actually set up to hold and support and value and see the work that you're doing. And that does require legwork. But like in the case of this author, she was sitting there in London, she was reading PW regularly, right? And trying to think about who's out there who might care about this project.
Awesome. Thank you. And yeah, I was actually going to throw this question to Marie as well. So, in terms of kind of being on the other side of the desk, so to speak, like, is this a question that, has come up for you, in terms of writers who are sort of outside traditional age parameters or based abroad?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's come up, but actually in maybe I don't know if other people would find it surprising necessarily, but it's not quite like, okay, I feel like I need to publish, let's say, young writers in their 20s and 30s because like that's the kind of stereotypical figure of a debut writer that I want to publish. I think for me, it's more of a question of there have been questions about like uh, it's like age and maybe the book that they're writing, right? I think sometimes like age comes up as a question with memoir. Like there, you kind of have to face when you're talking to a publisher about pitching a book and it's a 25-year-old memoirist, then the question becomes, okay, like why is a 25, like what kind of story can we expect a 25-year-old to tell? And you have to be in assessing these stories, then you have to kind of imagine, okay, well, then who's the audience? Like, are they also 25-year-olds? Like, is there a concentrated experience that they're talking about that fits? And so it's like a nuanced conversation, I think, that we have around age. And it's actually it wasn't until I started thinking about this panel and even hearing this question that I I recognize that age may be a barrier to publication but that's naive. I might be just naive there because I feel like I have in my head these exceptional stories like the one Anjali is sharing about a 76-year-old novelist who has sold a book to a big five publisher. I think Bonnie Garmis was kind of famously also I forget exactly how old she was, but that was part of for Lessons in Chemistry. That was like a big part of her story of success, like the discovery of this writer. And I think there have been more success stories recently of these kind of untraditional, surprising, like people of all ages
Like
fight
the
like their
correspondent,
story. What?
which just
Oh
got,
yeah, the
you know,
correspondent.
there was a nice profile about her. Sorry to interrupt, but
No, Patrick Ryan's Buckley. This is also he's also like not like he had been writing for a while and then like only has found success in kind of the later stages of his career. So I, I feel like recently, maybe it's perspective bias, but I do feel like, yeah, there have been success stories where people have been getting their stories published in like at all different stages of their lives. I think I'll say about the geographical parameters for me. Um, One thing I'll say, because I think about this a lot. Anjali is right. She pegged me like I'm obsessed with international stories. I'm obsessed with diasporic stories. Um, but where the writer is based, where a concrete um, issue I think to consider is prize consideration. I think for me, like a lot of the books that the publications that I imagine for the books that I want to work on here at Random House, there's a serious awards component to it, and some of a lot of awards come with citizenship or residency requirements. I think that's like becoming less and less the case. Like the Pulitzers, I think this past year they loosened their citizenship requirements, which is really great. But when the question about geographical parameters came up, I feel like that's one element, like that's one kind of factor that publishers, or at least publishers like myself, kind of have to think about when we decide to take on a book or not.
I was going to add on that I think jumping in to the industry is hard, but it's also a little bit easier than navigating a career like mid-career now. Like that's when I think age does sort of like if you're a mid-career writer in your 50s or 60s, I think that's a little bit harder than being like, oh, I'm just publishing my first book at this age because publishing does like a new thing, a new untried thing. Um, and what Maria said about the prizes is really important. And back to the Kaya Press story, like those books were published and held in this really beautiful way. And that first publication really shone a light on those authors and got them the platform and the award, which is why they were able to move to an agent and then move to a big five publisher, presumably because the work is then that much easier. Like the small press took on the work that the big publishers used to do, which is like built that first level of the platform and then gave the big press something to work with. And even though I have a lot to say about the corporatization of publishing and how commercial it's become, I we also have a media landscape where it's so hard to get any kind of attention for books. And so in a way, for the big five publisher to publish effectively, they need the tools of that sort of early platform building that is often done before you move to a big five house.
Thank you both so much for that. This next question kind of came up under the context of like working with an agent, but I'm going to broaden this question a little bit. So what happens if you receive, whether it's a manuscript or a finished piece, in the context of being an editor in a magazine, say, or an agent or an editor at a publishing house? So what happens if you get a manuscript that you think is really great, you're excited about it, but it perhaps needs a bit more work or development than like you can take on at this point? And I think the term that's often used in the industry is like revise and resubmit. Is this a thing that happens? And I'm gonna throw it to you, Mimi, actually.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to just start, from this place of submitting to, let's say, a lit journal like The Offing, um, you know, I think, as I said at the beginning, I think really making sure it is as solid as possible before you go in. I think that's just because like a lot of lit journals get a high volume of submissions. So, I think sometimes editors are probably looking more for pieces that are like ready to go, and giving the limited time and resources, and that a lot of editors at literary magazines are volunteers too. They have a limited kind of uh, time to be able to work on a piece. That being said, um, I certainly have gotten pieces where, I really love the idea or I saw so much potential. And, I did really want to invest the time to work with that writer to get the piece like where I think it could be and then publish it, in the offing. And so in that case, you might get a letter or email back that says, are you open to revising? We might not necessarily guarantee that it will get published, but that's certainly like the goal if I'm going to be, spending this time with you working on this piece. So that does happen. And then, it's really like the ball is in the writer's court, like, are they open to these ideas? Are they open to these suggestions? And if we kind of have an aligned vision, then that's great. Then, happy to put in that work. That's, sometimes writer pushes back and that's okay too. It's your piece, it's your work, your name's going to be attached to it. So you should really feel like you agree with the kind of edits that you're getting from an editor back. So yeah, that's something, I would kind of throw out there for, in the kind of literary magazine publishing world.
Thank you. Neela, I'm wondering if you could answer this question as well.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, we have an editorial board at Kaya, and we, are really careful about what we choose. We don't publish that many books a year. We publish around 4 to 6 books a year, so and we're a really small team. So, everything that comes through is, we has to be really important. We have like kind of a unanimous vote rule on that board, so it really has to, wow all of us. And that way, I think one of the the arguing factors in our editorial board is, if one of the editors, there's 2 editors, like actual, editors on the board, along with other folks from the community, writers and scholars and different people. So I think, if one of us really is like, okay, I know you guys don't feel like it's ready, but we really want to champion this. We definitely have taken time over the years to work with writers to revise, and we've done both revise and resubmit, and the editorial board will look at it again and we'll give you some notes. And then we've done, taken books and worked with them. Even like I was saying with Mimi's book, we didn't work with Mimi for a long time, but that was interesting. I think it might come up later because Mimi Locke had gotten such a, resounding rejection from agents. She worked with an editor to make her book more commercial. And then, so the first thing we did was ask to see the original stories that took out all of the notes that made it commercial. And then, we worked with her. So I think we're, in a unique space in that way to say, what did you want this to be before, you went down this road? Or even with Annalise, I think right before she gave the book to us, she had like gotten notes from her writing group and rewritten it. And we were like, no, none of this. We want to see the original. So it's always a journey with us. So we do both. I mean, I'm definitely, as the managing editor of Kaya, I'm definitely like, we don't have like as much, I think, time. There's so much pressure on all of us to raise money and do all of these things as a nonprofit publisher, that I definitely try to only, we just in general have less time for that, but it is a process that we've done, and I feel like is part of, our, what we really care about at Kaya is finding authors and working with them. Also, just to go back to that previous question too, we published this collected connected short story collection of a writer named Jean Oishi, and he was 82 when we published his book, and he was actually, and his novel or his connected short stories was about his experience in being interned as like a boy in the Japanese internment because he was Japanese American and lived on the West Coast. And he just had it was again like such a powerful story because he had become a journalist. He had, come out of that experience, totally traumatized, and written a memoir about it. But after he retired as being a journalist, he was a longtime journalist in Baltimore. He went back and got his MFA in creative writing and fiction at Johns Hopkins and wrote these stories. And it was only when he wrote those stories in fiction that he accessed the trauma of all of those years. And then it took him another 10 years to write it because he had to, for the first time in his life, really investigate and kind of go to therapy and deal with all of this stuff. So that was that was one of the first books I think I worked on when I came to Kaya. And I thought that story was so powerful. So speaking back to that, for older writers too, sometimes it is that story that can really, bring that book and the importance of that book forward.
Wow, that is an amazing story. Thank you so much for sharing that and for sharing all your wisdom on this topic. I'm going to transition a little bit to a slightly different area of publishing. So we've been talking a lot about like going on submission or, bringing your project out to editors, and whether, an agent is part of that or sometimes they're not. But I want to ask this next question, which is how can writers prepare for that period when you are going out on submission? And I'm going to throw it to Anjali.
You mean you have an agent or and they're submitting the book or you're trying to find or both?
I think probably the first part. We could start with that. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So it is a really nerve-wracking process. And one of the things that when I worked at Aisha Pandey Literary, a small agency before I started my own, and one thing that I really admired about that agency is Aisha really believed in radical transparency because this industry is very opaque and it's historically a little bit clubby too. And agents tend to not talk much to the author about the process, at least in the old school way of doing it, was to protect the author as much as possible. And I mean, there was a scandal not that long ago where an agent like literally hadn't even officially signed up the person and had sent the book out, right? There's a kind of entitlement in this industry when you kind of you are kind of a cultural tastemaker and you have access, right? But so I put everything on a spreadsheet and we talk it through, and every rejection is on that spreadsheet. And so the authors can actually, if they want to have access, or they can say, take me off, I don't want to know now that we're in the process. But like, for some people, they manage their anxiety by being able to see and kind of know what you've done and when you poked and what the rejections are and where things stand. And other people, really don't want to know. But my advice is always just really, truly throw yourself into something else. Just don't think about it, like just think about the next project because you have done everything we have done together, done everything we possibly can ahead of putting it out in the world. And now it's out of our hands. But a really important point that I have to make again and again, and I think this is part of the journey of being an artist and putting yourself out there and putting yourself up for rejection, is I'm most people who are rejecting you, including agents, are not arbiters of the quality of the work that you have produced, right? Sometimes it isn't quite there and sometimes it's not ready, but sometimes it's like our job is really to like kind of read the market, right? Or try and think where things might fit into the market. And that's actually very different from something existing as having cultural value or being the best iteration of itself. And so I really am not there to tell you, is it good or is it bad? I'm there to tell you, do I think there's a place in the market for this? And when we send it out into the world, we both believe it's good and has value, right? But sometimes the market says, we don't know what to do with this. That sometimes that's helpful, and you can go and kind of rejigger the proposal or the project based on feedback that you've gotten. But anyway, I've gone off topic. Yes, when your book is on submission, and that can be a very, very, very long process, just try not to think about it and do the things that you love and focus on the next project. Because a lot of people's first books are really their second book or third book.
Yeah, thank you for that. And not off topic at all. I think that distinction that you made about, the market versus like the cultural artistic value of something is really important for all of us to remember in this business and in this world, which can be tough sometimes. Okay. I'm curious about, actually, before we move on to the next question, I'm wondering if you can address the second part of that question, Neela. So what happens if a writer, like how can a writer prepare to go on submission if they're kind of doing it on their own and they're submitting like directly to a smaller press maybe or other publishers?
Yeah, I think I've appreciated when people, you know, introduce themselves to me at events and, let me know that they're interested in submitting. I think there's nothing wrong with that. My emails are available too. So somebody, if we use Submittable now, but people want to kind of reach out and connect and let me know, I think is useful to, because we are open in that way. Also in general, like this would probably be done before, but be familiar with what we're doing at Kaya and, kind of be able to talk to me about that or what they're interested in their work. I think that's always useful, but getting to know the the ways that people what is happening at the press, especially if it is like a small literary journal or a press where, being able to, do the little things like follow us on social media, kind of know what our community, become a part of our community, that I think is useful. It definitely can't hurt. I think, sometimes that like, um, we get at like the big writer conferences, like at AWP, when people come to your booth and they're like, wow, these books look amazing. What are they? And, and people are like, oh, we're an Asian American, Asian diasporic press. And people will be like, oh, I guess not for me, obviously, and walk away, is like, I think, obviously, hopefully nobody on this call would do that. But I think that sense can still happen sometimes where you're like, oh, I learned about that. I submitted to this place and I learned about it and I was really into it. And now I didn't get a story published there. So I'm never going to read them again. And I think that's not the right, you know what I mean? That's not the right way to be somebody in the literary community. We're all, whether it's PRH or Kaya, we're all part of the same things, and you're gonna continue to like love books that come out of these places. You're gonna love stories, and I think having that openness to being like, okay, this particular project didn't work out, or this story didn't work out, but maybe they can still be on my list. I think for us, because we are so small, and I've had to reject so many friends and community members over the years because, if you're looking for, oh, this project feels really right for a small Asian American press, there's not that many of it. So I think that's been important for me also as an editor to be like, okay, that's why, especially if it's a project that I care about, that I encourage somebody to submit and it doesn't get accepted, which is, going to happen like 95% of the time because there's just not that, publishing is hard. I really, I'm always really chuffed when I can continue to have that relationship and usually so many times when it's that, when somebody is, has submitted and is really close and it gets rejected, I know that they're going to get published really soon. I kind of have that sense. And if I have the time and energy, I can be like, you should try these places. I think the project would be great for that. So I feel so, lucky to have been able to do that and talk through rejection in that way with so many people. But it's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, thank you so much for that really comprehensive answer. My next question is sort of about, what kind of like sparks your interest when reading a submission? And in addition to the writing itself, the project itself, what do you look for in a potential author? And then the third question, so it's really three questions wrapped up in one, is related to that. How important is something like a social media platform for an author to have? And I'm going to throw that one to you, Marie.
Um, I both love and hate this question because I know I'm already rolling my eyes at the answer that I give, which is it's very woo-woo. I'm not a woo-woo person, so I apologize to everyone in advance. But that question of like, what is it about a submission, about a writing proposal, about a novel that comes into my submissions inbox? What is it that like sparks my interest in it? And it's a feeling that I have in my gut of a- a- it's a feeling that I have my a gut and also like a thought process that has to cognitive process that has to go through my head. The cognitive process that goes through my head is sort of similar to what Anjali has brought up about like the question of the market, right? I have to put on my publisher's hat and I have to kind of project myself across like the next, I don't know, 2, 3 years and imagine myself editing the book, pitching the book to my colleagues here at Random House, working with my colleagues here at Random House to start to get the book out into the world. Once the book is out into the world, who do I connect it to? What are the blurbers I go to? Who are the people that, like, who are my friends in media that I can like hand this book to and say, you must cover this? I have to like have that I have to have that vision of publishing that book come across in my head, and it has to feel clear and like well, as clear as possible in that moment. I have to be a bit of a fortune teller. Um, that's the cognitive process. And also like that kind of market question of like, okay, who are the readers? Actually, that whole publishing process is like that journey that and the end game of that or the end point of that journey is arriving at a reader's lap. And I have to be able to imagine who that reader is. And how do I get to that reader? The kind of woo-woo part of the question that I cringe at sometimes is like, yeah, it's that gut feeling of like, I can't I'm hooked. I can't stop thinking about it. It haunts me in my dreams. There's something about the writing that is like it's special that I feel obsessed with, that I have to be the one to claim it and say, I was the one who edited this book and, brought it out into the world. I think like similar, I think, to how Neela is, I publish at Random House, I publish about 8 to 10 books a year. So it's a higher volume than the 4 to 6. But it's still a sense of like you put in a lot of effort behind not a small, like a pretty limited number of books every year. And every single book, you have to like kind of imagine pouring your all into it for like 3, 4 years. And so like I have to kind of check boxes on like both the does this make a business sense for me? Like, how can I talk about this intellectually? And then also, can I convey that passion? Can I kind of transmute that like that gut feeling I have in my tummy to my colleagues? Because I think like another thing about publishing, at least like the corner of publishing that I work on, is it is like a very much a passion-driven industry where we're people who are at our core book readers, and you can like sniff each other out because you talk about books with the same level of like mania, the same level of like we're all just English nerds like at the end of the day who like love the written word. And so you can't really disguise like you can't disguise that. And I think like there are probably publishers out there and editors out there who on balance maybe move a lot more with their head than their guts, and then also the other way around, maybe some who are much more intuitive people. But I think it's always kind of been that balance for me, and I would assume a lot of my colleagues, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious about how you would approach that question about like an online platform, like how
Oh
important
yeah,
that is.
I knew I forgot that. To me, so not important. I mean, I guess I want to say so not important, I think just by gut, but the other part of it is like maybe depending on what book you're doing, right? So if like let's say I'm acquiring a book because I'm in it for the platform, then yeah, I think like then the platform is going to be the main thing I'm evaluating. But um let's say if it's like not necessarily connected to I'm going to backtrack a little bit because I think I've provided like smarter responses to this kind of question about platform. So I think sometimes it's important to distinguish between capital P platforms and capital P, like lowercase p platforms. Capital P platforms are the kind of like stereotypical ones that you can think of, like the obvious ones where you have like, do you have a million followers on Instagram? Do you have like a Substack, like a multi-thousand follower Substack, podcast, whatever? And yeah, those can always be additive in publishing a book. Like Anjali has said, like the big five publishers like to kind of take on projects where there are already a lot of tools at our disposal to build buzz and interest and consumer engagement for a book, because at the end of the day, we are a for-profit business and we want to sell books. But for me, I think, again, because I kind of publish in the like more literary space, where I can kind of get away with with writers who get away with publishing writers who are like maybe hermits or aren't necessarily like the most Instagram savvy users. I think about small P platform as like what are the communities and the networks that they can call on, that can like uh, legitimize isn't quite the word, but maybe give meat to the work that they're doing, and like maybe point to like the kind of labor that they've put into building themselves as an artist, not as a singular individual, but as an artist who exists in community. So that's sort of how I distinguish between like, again, big P platform and then like smaller P platform. And smaller P platform can include like where have you published in terms of literary magazines. For me, because I also publish a lot of academic writers and scholars who want to speak to a mainstream audience, small P platform in that situation, for instance, includes like, okay, what um, are you part of the conference circuit in your discipline? Like, are you a professor at a respected institution? So you don't, those are platforms that don't have direct access to a book buyer necessarily, but it's still a platform that helps me, the publisher, communicate who you are and why you are the person to be writing your book to the various levels of gatekeepers who will then help us sell your book.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I do always think about the irony of the fact that like as writers, many of us are on the introverted side, and then there's this expectation of like now I have to be on Instagram and make videos and all that. So this is a very reassuring answer, I think, for many of us. So speaking of sort of like the publishing and marketing aspect, I'm curious to get your perspective on how the publishing industry's approach to publishing and marketing Asian American stories has changed over the years. How has that readership changed, grown? Um, yeah, so I'm curious about your take on that. And I'm gonna throw it to Anjali, actually.
Oh, I really want to hear what Marie has to say. Um, I was gonna say I don't feel that there's an infrastructure of support or interest in anything to do with Asia in mainstream publishing. Back a while ago, Sunny Mehta was an Indian man who was the head of Knopf, and that was the most prestigious publisher, and he was someone with a lot of power in publishing. And I, it wasn't a perfect system and it was definitely a boys' club, but I don't think I recognized at the time that we worked together, which was the early 2000s, what a rare moment that was, that someone who had that identity, who moved through the world as an Indian man and actually had a certain politics still filtered through a very commercial workspace, but would publish books that were about India and specific, but because he understood the value. And I, as someone who cares a lot about subjects related to internationally in general and South Asia in particular, I really actually feel like publishing is super trend driven. And obviously there are exceptions to the rule. And obviously I represent a lot of South Asian writers who have been successfully published. So it's not that it doesn't happen, but it does mean that you're lucky if you get one buyer as opposed to 13 people bidding on something and in fact, I did sell one book at auction, a book that just won the Pulitzer. So that was pretty exciting. That was a Chinese American story. It was a graphic novel. And it really helped that there were three Asian editors positioned in places that could do graphic novels that loved it and felt a strong connection to it. And I know that is why we had an auction. I mean, obviously, it was also a very good project because it went on to win multiple prizes. But just to say that, like, who's there and who the gatekeepers are and how they are thinking about audience really does translate into whether or not you can get a publisher to commit, how much, at what level they're going to commit. And I very, very cynically, and this is why I really want to hear Marie's take, feel like publishing is still walks around with this very internal, not necessarily consciously articulated idea of who the audience is. And that audience is still, I think, a middle-aged white woman in the Midwest. Like that is the quintessential audience member. And I remember 20 years ago when I wanted to buy the book Persepolis, again, not an American story, not an author based here, a graphic novel. Um, I had a colleague who had worked for Book of the Month Club who said to me, I just don't know who the audience would be. And I knew in my bones that there would be an audience for that book. Like I knew it, I knew it. It was like that feeling Marie talked about, like the in your gut, like you can't stop thinking about something. And I was very lucky that that colleague wasn't my boss and didn't have the power to not let me acquire that book. But it also taught me really early on how subjective that idea of audience is. And I think publishing still really centers. And you have to think about who is dispensing the money, who's working in marketing, who's working in sales, right? Like there are all these channels beyond just the face of the editor. But even having said that, the number of Asian, although Maria and I were just at a party that celebrated Asian Americans in publishing, and there were many, many, many people, all much younger than me. So I'm also speaking from my own positionality, which is, I'm in my 50s. I don't know all the young people in publishing, but I do know as a seller, it's and the kinds of projects I'm selling, it's very, very, very rare that I feel like, oh, there's somebody well positioned who has power who will see the value in this.
Thank you for that. I would love to hear all of your takes on this. So I'll throw it to Marie first, and then we can go from there.
I don't think I could have avoided it after Anjali called on me twice. Um, yeah, I think I'm not as cynical, I don't think. Maybe because I am riding that high of that wonderful party that we went to where I saw so many of my peers. But this is why representation matters, through and through, because I do think that publishing, and like we're kind of talking in these like big abstract terms, but if you'll allow that for a minute, I mean, publishing is very trend driven, and in like about 5 years ago it was very trendy and important to be able to kind of publicly say, like, invest and show a lot of energy and put a lot of energy not just behind AAPI stories but also like BIPOC in general. And yeah, I from my perch, that kind of concentrated language and energy has shifted, and it's not the same anymore. It's kind of gone back to like a more consumer driven, sales driven, like what are the books that work? Like we want to publish books for every reader, but then it's like when you lose the like specific language around like boosting BIPOC AAPI stories, queer stories, what have you, then you kind of risk losing, like you risk under publishing those stories to begin with. So uh but that being said, I have felt I have felt like a lot of optimism, I think, because um the diversity of editors, and not just editors, Anjali's right. Like it's just a matter, it's a it uh the support a book sees, that support from like known experience that a book sees has to be felt across like the whole kind of publishing bookmaking team. So yes, there are more BIPOC editors in publishing, but it's also like publishing in general is kind of diversifying. And I do think that I no longer feel like I'm the only brown face in a room, and that kind of emboldens me as an acquirer and a publisher. Um, so I don't exactly know if I'm answering this question so much as like kind of word vomiting. But I hope that's sort of helpful, at least to kind of situate myself as like, yes, agreeing with Anjali that publishing right now at least isn't kind of investing in these stories in at least the most like very direct kind of like focused way that they were maybe 5 years ago. But at the same time too, like I still feel like in my perch, I have a lot of leeway in terms of publishing the stories that I've always wanted to publish, which always include Asian American stories. And I yeah, I still feel like there's like hope for the future in that case.
I want
Yeah.
to, can
Oh,
I just,
sorry. Go ahead.
a little PS? I do think it's also like you are in this amazing position. Like you truly have a wonderful job. But also you're in the position of being a buyer. So you get to put your money where where what you care about, right? And it's really different being a seller, right? Like I have to look around and be like, who's going to get this? And that's where, yeah, there are a lot more people of color, but there are not that many with power, actually.
Thank you both for that. I think it's important that folks know just sort of like how consumer driven the publishing industry can be. And so I think this is really helpful for folks to hear. Mimi, I'd love to hear your take on this as well.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to come at this from a slightly different angle, because I think we've been hearing a lot about like the market, sales, you know, the things that are basically out of a writer's control, right? Like you have no control over this. This is not something that you can really prepare yourself for. And so, where does that leave you? Where does that leave you in your writing? And, so when I talk about that kind of like circular winding path and how maybe um, publishing at a small literary journal can be alongside this maybe longer publication road. I feel like if you're a writer, you want to make your art no matter what. Like you're not necessarily caring what the market says, but you do want readers, and you still want to be able to share your work. And so I think this is like a great time to then, if you're on submission and you're like waiting to hear back, maybe this is like the time to work on a short story. This is the time to pitch an essay, or work on something new, something maybe shorter that has a shorter turnaround time. And then this is when you can submit it to journals, and so have something sort of alive and motivating you and giving you that spark as you're waiting for these kind of bigger projects in motion. I have friends who write, let's say they're working on their novel, but maybe in between they're taking breaks to work on short stories as a little breather. So I think there's a way that you can still like find a way that you're still like tapping into like why you want to create art, in addition to, this business commerce side that maybe you have to also deal with as a writer. And I think this is where, speaking on behalf of the offing, right, like we are not market driven, like we don't have to worry about sales. We can really just publish writers because we think like they're making really interesting work, or it's like something we've never seen before, or just something I've been dying to read that came across my path, that I thought about when I was an editor there. So I think there is an audience or a reader for your work, even if it's a little bit outside of the mainstream.
Thank you so much for that. Neela, would you like to answer this question?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk more about how I think the marketing side of it, which I think is obviously as all of these industries has changed, it's changed so much. Like the even in the 15 years that I've worked at Kaya, like the shrinking of book pages in newspapers, like the amount of time it used to be, like 3 months. You have 3 months, you can really, you can do a whole PR campaign over 6 months, but you can really focus on that last 4 months. It's now a year to 6 months for sure. Like it is so far out. Like it really takes the spaces for which books are being, highlighted, how much money it takes to do a real promotional process for a book. And I think that it is tough because then you're jostling for these spaces. And that way I think there's new things too. Obviously people's like podcasts and the amount of like social media that people are being able to kind of focus on. I love all the bookstagrammers that I follow who are really highlighting Asian American titles. That is really exciting for me. But it definitely feels harder, right? That squeezes everything for all of us who don't have huge budgets for marketing, I think, and that's definitely been something that I think is challenging. And going back to like that platform question, it's not, we don't look at for a platform, but again, it's like we all as I think I'm not looking for people who have any kind of platform. That's not something we utilize at all to make decisions. But I am like looking for collaboration, right? I am looking for somebody who's excited to to really work with me to get their book out there. What do they want to do? Who are their, who do they think is gonna who do they want to be in conversation with? How do we do these things? So it's always been a challenge, obviously, trying to do marketing from a very small press, but it definitely feels harder lately. And I think I used to think of it as like a fun challenge, especially because we do like recovery books where the authors have been dead for like 100 years, or we're bringing something back. So and also we do a lot of books that are translated. So titles, this issue of like somebody who's kind of writing from a completely different space in a different language. And so I'm definitely trying to get in on get platform for these books in really tight spaces. So it's I think it's for sure a challenge of like what where you're able to find, and in that way it's not like you should have, I think, a platform where you have like 100,000 people ready to buy your book. But like again, I think that part of being a literary citizen kind of really comes in handy then, where you're like, oh, I read for this, journal, maybe they'll do a review, or like, I think those connections at the kind of smaller press level, if you're not going to a bigger publisher, can really come in handy. So it's always something to think about as part of that larger picture of how to think about it. Like that if you are going to publish a book, you will have to there is going to be a part where you're going to have to be involved in the promotions and thinking through what your angle is, how you can help with that, I think is important. And again, just creatively, not necessarily like numbers wise.
And if I could just chime in really quickly on that note, I feel like at the offing we get stuff sent to our inbox all the time about, when writers have books coming out and they want to promote it. And I will say, I'll get a lot of emails from PR people who I'm just like, I don't really know this person, but like as soon as a writer that we have published, like sends me an email, I am like, oh, okay, like we will absolutely find a way to help you, with your book. Whether that's like, do we want to do like an author Q&A, maybe with like the editor if they're still there who originally published the piece. I love when that happens. Maybe we can publish an excerpt. Like let's like at the very least we can help like promote it in our newsletter. So I think this is where like when you've kind of done that work, way back when to really build those relationships, to be part of these communities, then down the road, like you can call in those favors at that point. I'm also thinking about, Marie, I think I worked with one of your writers, Karen Chung, and we published one of her, I guess it was sort of like a hybrid essay at the offing way back when. And then as soon as, I heard that her memoir was coming out, I was like so excited. And we did like a whole conversation and, talked about kind of her journey from those sort of shorter pieces and her journalism that she did and how that, translated then into the book that came out. So I really love those full circle moments.
Also, this is just a really nice full circle moment in our conversation because this is really where we started, right? What's the value of querying literary magazines, even if it's not necessarily going to move the bar for the book deal? But this is the value. This is becoming part of a literary community. And you're going to have more people cheering for your book when it finally comes out because of the relationships you've built.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all so much for your takes on that. And 100% agree, Anjali. I feel like one major takeaway that I'm certainly getting from this conversation is that it's never about just like the one book or the one story or piece or the one project. It's really about building a career and an ecosystem for yourself, or just learning more about that ecosystem and where you might fit into it. Thank you all so much for that. I have so many more questions that we could chat about, but I want to make sure we get to our audience's questions because there are some really, really great questions here. So thank you to everyone who submitted a question so far. I'm just going to kind of go through, and I might be rephrasing some questions just so that we can combine and streamline as much as possible. So we've been talking, I think, a lot about prose specifically, but earlier we mentioned, what if someone's working on something hybrid or multi-genre or perhaps poetry? And so I do want to go a little bit more into specifics about those kinds of projects. So what are the circumstances for a literary agent to take on a poet, for example, who don't typically have agents? And then along with that, if you're a poet who's sort of submitting a manuscript to a press, how important is like the history of publication to that poetry book getting a publishing deal, perhaps? And how important is the synopsis for the book for poetry manuscripts? So those are a lot of very specific questions, but I would love for Anjali to answer that first part of the
Yeah,
question.
thanks, because that's the part I can't answer. I mean, a little bit anyway. I think if you're a poet and you won a major prize and you sold a lot of copies of that first book, you're going to get an agent. You may want to stay with your small press, but you also may have an opportunity to be published on a larger list, which I think for poetry isn't always necessarily better, because I do think there's a lot to be said to be published on a list where you are all part of the same community. And as we've said over and over and over again, publishing is really run in a very corporate way, and I don't think that is the best place to hold poetry. Um, but other circumstances in which you might get an agent is if you have poetry, but you're also working on something that's not poetry. So you're a poet, but you also have a memoir in the works. You're a poet. There's some other kind of you have a novel that you're hoping to write. Those are other times when you might get an agent or um, would be a moment to talk to an agent. So I would say if you're a poet and doing other things, or if you're a poet and you're selling at this level or you have the ambition to want to be on a more mainstream press list. That's my answer.
Thank you. I think for the next two questions, I might look to you, Neela. So just the questions about, how important is the summary and synopsis for a poetry book, and also how important is it for that poet to have a history of publications from respected journals?
Yeah, thank you. I think that I mean, the cover letter and the summaries are important. I do have a funny story. A couple of years ago, we got this cover letter from writer Jenny Liu, and she was saying how she was a former cage fighter, a mixed martial arts cage fighter, and she was like bringing the kind of the violence of the ring and all of that she had learned into like the violence of like diaspora, being like a biracial Chinese American writer. And I was like, oh my God, I'm like buying it, from the cover letter. And then I felt like it was she was also like a PhD and a scholar. She's like the most polymath person I know. But then when I read the manuscript, it wasn't quite ready. So it was a revise and resubmit for me. And like Sun Yang, the publisher of Kaya, doesn't read any of the cover letters. And so she liked the manuscript more. So definitely don't oversell your book, I think. But I mean, I think it's important for you to have that, so not, I think again in that collaborative process, for what I think when I'm looking at poetry manuscripts, which we publish a lot of poetry manuscripts, I want to see that there is, any book, any poetry manuscript has to be a really full project for me to want to publish it. I think that's what people are really looking for. There's so much great poetry out there now. It can't just be like, this is a collection of poems that I've written over the last 5 years, I think there's that work of bringing the narrative together. Like, what is this collection about? Not, that comes in that synopsis. So I do think it's really important to be able to have that, not just for me to read it and tell it to my editorial board, but because it's really important for you to be able to articulate that in the process of putting together that collection, and that it does really connect. What was the second part of the question?
About like a respected, like, how much do you have
Oh,
to have like a
and
history of respected
I
journals? Yeah.
think in the same way, like I don't like for that book which we published called Muscle Memory by Jenny, she didn't have like a ton of publications, but I was so interested, and then the editorial board was as well in her project that it totally didn't matter. But then there's other times where maybe I'm on the fence and I'll be like, oh wow, like they have so many, they've really been working on this, they have this great community, and I will, maybe as one of as in the editorial board meeting, like bring that to the room, bring that to the editorial board meeting and be like, they've really been published in all of these places. So for me, it's definitely like that, like a tiebreaker type of thing. It's not necessary, but when I see it, I'm definitely like, oh, I'm gonna take this person like more seriously.
Thank you. That's super helpful. Um, Another question we got was, how much editing does an editor do on your manuscript once it's been acquired? Marie, I'm going to throw that to you.
That's a good question. It depends. I think it's been my answer to all of these questions. It depends. And it depends on the publisher that you go to. It depends on the editor that you end up with. Different editors have different editing styles. There's the kind of editor who is more of an acquirer and they don't do a ton of editing. Or maybe and before putting it into production, or maybe they um, have like a lot of other responsibilities. So they ask someone who's to have a role of like the desk editor, whether it's a more junior editor, do the editing for them and then move that over. So I'll speak to my kind of style, which is a lot more hands-on. My favorite parts of the job are acquiring and finding new voices, getting excited about books, getting excited about submissions that come across my desk and acquiring them for the list. The other like really kind of important part of the job for me is editing. So um, I like to edit a lot. I do fiction and nonfiction. For nonfiction, that's usually the heavier editorial lift that comes for me. So especially if it's a book that I bought on proposal, um, that means that, I'm buying a book on the basis of like a 20 to 60 page document that an agent helped put together. And so, you go through the process, you fall in love with the book, you pitch it to your publisher, you get the money, you buy it in an auction. For me, what the process of editing that project looks like is starting with the author on the kind of big picture, like let's get the roadmap down for this book. Let's make sure that the story makes sense and like the narrative works, the logic works, and then over the course of however many years, the author starts sending me like small chapters here and there, and it begins just this dialogue with the author of like, is this the book that we wanted to publish when we agreed to work together? Are you on that right path? Have you taken a wild left turn? It's not quite at the like granular level line editing yet. It's still kind of a work in progress, and we're very much kind of shaping it together. And then kind of hopefully somewhere down the road, the writer kind of finds their sea legs and I can send them off to their writing studio, leave me alone for a few months or a year or whatever, and then come back with the final draft that I hope to then go through maybe once. Again, depending on the work that they've done, have they made it better? Have they made it worse? So it all depends. Like sometimes I've gone through several rounds of editing on a book. Sometimes I only have to edit once. That's nonfiction. For fiction, it's kind of funny because it really I chalk it I I'm losing my vocabulary here. I chalk it up to the temperament of a novelist over like, let's say, a nonfiction writer. Um, so I buy novels largely like as finished manuscripts. They come into me after having gone through like a fair amount of work with the agent or with a literary magazine, for instance. And by the time it gets to me, it's pretty polished. And also the author is pretty much near the end of their rope in terms of how many edits they want to go to. So I've actually had the experience many times of like falling in love with a novel and saying, this is perfect, but can we also do this? And then the writer just being like, no, don't talk to me about editing this book. I'm not interested in that. Sometimes that's not true. Sometimes I work with some novelists who do very much want to be edited and still have that still have like a little bit of oomph and like bandwidth left in them to do it. So um, we go through like maybe one round of like a structural edit combined with some kind of line edit. But I think for me on the fiction side, when I have my fiction editor hat on, I'm like kind of less in the lines. I'm less in the weeds than I am on nonfiction. I feel like I have much more license to like take a sentence in a work of nonfiction and like really rejigger it. Fiction, I feel like I'm playing therapist, where I ask like, is this character really gonna do this? Like, why are they, does that make a lot of sense? So it's a lighter touch. It's kind of more behind the scenes work, but that is more the question of how I edit rather than how much editing goes into a manuscript once it's been brought over to a publisher. But I think that just to go back, the answer is it kind of depends, and there are kind of different stages that we go through before we move on and we get to the final manuscript.
Thank you. That's super helpful to know. We also have a bunch of questions about querying. So let's see. Okay, this is a question specifically about query letters. I know the standard is to open with a connection to a book that the agent has sold, but how important is it to do this versus just opening with the summary of what your book is about? And if you're trying to get representation for a short story collection, would it be wise to mention that that you're also working on a novel? And Anjali, I'm going to throw that to you.
Um, I think it is actually really important that you make a connection with the agent. At least from my perspective, I want to know that you know who I am when you write to me. You don't have to say your book is like one of my books, and sometimes that feels very forced when people try to do that. But I think you have to, it is helpful to me if you can make a case in the opening about why you're approaching me in particular. And the more I feel known, the more I'm inclined to read the letter because I think, A, this person has done their homework. This person knows enough about who I am to think that I might be interested in what they're doing. And therefore, there's a better chance that I will be interested in what they're doing. I get a lot of queries where I feel like, do you have any idea who I am? Like, meaning I'm not interested in a book with like guns and violence. I'm not interested, like you don't have, I don't have a sense that you really know what my list looks like. You're talking to me about you. But I think in order to get me to want to pay attention to you, it's really helpful for me to know that you have a sense of who you're talking to. And then I would say another big maybe mistake with queries is people sort of bury the lead. Like I don't really want to know. I want to know why you queried me, and then I immediately want to know how to think about the book. What place on the bookshelf does this book sit on? And that's kind of what the purpose of those comp titles is. It isn't necessarily to say, my story is about a girl who is growing up in Iran, therefore it's like Persepolis. What I want is for you to suggest to me through those comps that you sort of know which readers you're going for, right? Like it's not like the externals, but it's sort of the vibe. It's like I'm trying to say something in the world that's a little bit similar to Katie Kitamura, and or like one of my favorite query letters ever opened with, if Salman Rushdie and Barbara Kingsolver had a love child, it would be my novel. Now, it's breaking a lot of rules because you're comparing yourself to two greats and you're comparing yourself to like, not necessarily a super recent book, but it helped me know how to think about this book. And I think that's what I want first. It's like, because part of what makes a book sell is being able to turn around and say, read this book because, and being able to talk about it in pretty simple terms. And I know it sounds really reductive to reduce something complex to something simple, but that elevator pitch is really important in terms of um, really you're approaching an agent because you are selling me on giving my time to something. And the clearer a picture you can paint of what the thing is that you're selling me on, the easier it is for me to imagine how I can sell it. Because that is back to the cross commercialism of it. What my part of this industry, right, is luckily Maria and I both get to do it for things that we super care about, but it is like, frankly, you have to sell me on why I should care about your book. And that is the goal of the query letter. Query letter, it is a sales tool. And it is actually quite different than writing the novel or whatever that you wrote. Writing that query letter is a slightly different task. And my job is then to take that, but you have to give me the tools in that letter so that I can imagine how I can then turn around and sell it to an editor who's also inundated with submissions. So what is going to make somebody pay attention?
Thank you for that. I think the second part of the question too was about, if I have a short story collection, should I mention to a prospective agent that I have a novel?
I mean, that is what you're always told, right? Like, you're not gonna be able to sell a short story collection if you don't have a novel. So I think if you have a novel, you should mention it. And if you don't make it up. Um, you know, you for the story collection, you still have to tell a story about why you think this book should be the first book of yours in the world. And there, I always say, like, is there a thematic, kind of the way we have to talk about poetry now, right? Like, is there a thematic link? Is there a way to talk about this as a book? Um, then you can sell a story collection. And in fact, the perceived wisdom for so long was you can't sell stories. But then I feel like with people reading on devices and we've had many successful story collections, it's not like, oh, you can't sell a story collection. I think people are actually pretty open to story collections. And I think in general, novels have also gotten a little bit more unconventional than they used to be. So like I like this story. Annie Wong, my former colleague at Aisha Pandey Literary, sold Sequoia Nagamatsu's novel, How High We Go in the Dark. But like 2 weeks before she sold it, it was a story collection. Like she figured out how to talk about it in a way that she could position it as a novel, and it worked. It is actually a series of individual stories, but all in the same world. And that was, yeah, it was really good marketing. And that is part of what we have to do. So yes, so story collections are saleable, and it's okay to approach an agent with just a story collection, but you have to be able to pitch it in a way that makes me know, oh, this is like, okay, basic rule of selling anything in this industry. This is like this and this, but new and different in this way. That's what you want to say. I'm approaching you because, and this is new and different, and this is how to think about it.
If I can just add like a little bit to that second part of the question about the short, like if you're a short story writer, should you also mention that you're working on a novel? Do you feel pressure about to work on a novel? I feel like for when that kind of question, when that becomes a relevant question on the publisher side, when I'm evaluating, say, like a short story collection that's come across my desk, yeah, that is a question that my publisher always asks me is like, well, do they have a novel? Like, what's going on with that? But I also will say that a conversation that I find really helpful if I am interested in the story collection, and this comes across actually with any book that I'm interested, is like this question of asking the author, well, what is the career you envision for yourself? Like, do you want to just be a short story writer? Is that what you want to do? Like, do you see yourself as doing, are you primarily like a George Saunders in like the short fiction mode, or do you see yourself as wanting to expand into a novelist and like wanting and just needing to get the short story collection out because it's what you've worked on and you want to publish it? So I think like kind of having like a longer view and a sense of yourself as a writer and what career you're aiming for, that's probably a pretty good conversation to have with your agent, and then afterwards with the editors that are interested in the submission.
Thank you both so much for that. This next question goes kind of back to our the earlier part of our conversation where we spoke about literary magazines and journals and how they can be really helpful for an author who's trying to get their start. And this question was, where do I learn about opportunities for volunteering at literary magazines?
That is a really good question. It makes me mourn a little bit when literary Twitter was more of a thing because I think people really did use that as a tool. I also remember the age of Facebook groups being really active, and so maybe this is all dating me, but I would say, like, I think this is again why it's so important to be like doing your research, to kind of taking that initiative to find these journals, and then take the extra effort to, I think at this point most journals have some form of social media presence, whether that's Instagram or Blue Sky. So, I think following these journals that you like, reading them, following them. I know at the offing, we will post opportunities. A lot of, almost all, I think, journals also have like newsletters too, where they're, amplifying opportunities, whether that's submissions or volunteering. So I think doing that kind of homework to research those places and then signing up, following. And I think that's often the best way to get kind of like just like the direct news from them about it.
Thank you. I also had, I feel like we've touched on this maybe a little bit earlier, but just in terms of thinking about, marketing oneself or learning about how to talk about one's own work and writing and the sort of trajectory of your career. We have a really interesting question here. Does it hurt or help a writer to work on different genres? For example, YA, lit fic, fantasy, is consistently writing in the same genre, to create a sort of brand for yourself, if you will. Is that necessary? I'm gonna throw it to Neela.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think it's, you know, I, I, I think if it's, if we're thinking about like projects, right? Like if, I mean, again, it's just going to be about the best work. If you have a mind that's like capacious enough that can jump from, you know, poetry to fantasy, then, go for it. I don't think that like it works against you in any way as long as the work is really dedicated and good. I definitely think that like even at a little place like Kaya, when you're trying to like fit into a trend and you're writing led by like the genre or the trend, it's pretty clear to editors and agents that like it's not organic in that way. So I would say, writing into like what is like you're most passionate about, and if that's coming out in fantasy or horror, which is really popular right now, right? Then go for it. I'm constantly trying to, I love reading all of this new horror that's coming out from writers of color, and I was teaching like a Asian American science fiction, fantasy, and horror class last summer at UCLA, and I was like, wow, there's not enough Asian Americans writing horror, so please do that, everyone. But so I think that it's definitely about that. Like if you have an idea, even if you're like, I just said that, and you're like, I've never thought about writing horror. Wait, I actually have a really good idea. So I think it's definitely about like the ideas and the passion. And it doesn't hurt you if you have things in multiple genres, but definitely don't do it, because I said it unless you're really excited about it.
Everyone's gonna go home and work on their horror manuscripts now, which I'm here for. Um, we also got a question about that first year of publishing the book. Your dreams have come true, you're publishing a book. What should an author expect during that first year? And any tips for managing expectations? I'm gonna throw it over to Anjali.
That's a hard question. What you can expect, to echo Marie, really depends on what kind of a publisher you're with, what promises they've made, how much um, how much they spend on the book in some ways, if it's in a big place. And I guess I'm saying that partly because if they gave you enough money, then you have some resources that you can put towards investing maybe in outside support, because in many places, um, there's just limited resources. Like publicists are given a lot of books to work on in a given month, and you can kind of tell. You have usually a kickoff call about 3 months ahead of publication with your editor and publicity and marketing. And that's kind of where you sort of debrief with your agent after, and you read the room. Like, how did that feel? Do people seem excited? Do they feel like they have a vision for what they're going to do? Um, uh, Sometimes, editors leave. That happens a lot, and they're kind of abandoned. And then um, I think that's actually when it's really good to have an agent, because you sort of have already a team member who's going to sort of be strategizing. But anyway, what you can expect is 3 months of attention around like a 3 month window where the publicist is assigned to work on your book and things might happen. And after that, if nothing has happened, things can happen if you do them, but your publisher is not going to do them. And I'm again, I I'm kind of cynical, and also Marie might have a different take because she's actually working inside a publishing house now. But I feel like I try to manage my authors' expectations around what other people are going to be doing for them. And everyone from the small press to the big press is really relying on the author to activate their network and show up to promote the book and have ideas about who to reach out to. Like publishers can be very willing participants and collaborators. They'll often, especially the big five, have the resources to send books to a big targeted mailing list, but they do not have the resources often. It depends. They're definitely different. It's not a monoculture. But in general, I would say most of the publishers aren't going to do like a specific mailing list to a specific target. They won't be thinking about a target audience beyond everyone, um, unless you help them say, "Oh, I'm connected to this community. I'm connected to that community. Can we reach out to this person?" Like if you are an active partner, the publisher has resources and can do big mailings and things like that if it's a big place. But I would say that what publishers can do is actually really limited, and sitting and waiting for your publisher to do things, you will be disappointed. But that's why it's actually so hard with the first book, in that first book situation where you don't have a platform and you've never been through it before and you don't really know what to do with a big five. And that's why it actually, I think, is helpful to start your career at the big five when you've had some experience. Like I was the agent for an author who had published two novels, one with a big five and then one with Feminist Press. And with Feminist Press, she had done like a 40 city author tour that she planned herself and had gotten so much knowledge on how to promote herself. And then I became her agent for the next book, which was a memoir. And everything that she had learned, kind of collaborating with Feminist Press, she brought to bear when we went back to a big five with the memoir. So, anyway, all this to say that this is another reason it's good to be part of a literary community because you can talk to your friends about their experiences, like gather information. Um, but I think it's really hard for editors to have, like, editors kind of know that there's a hierarchy of which books are getting the resources in-house. And it's very painful as an editor because you do have 8 to 10 books a year and they're not all going to get the same amount of love, but you love them almost all the same, right? So, and there isn't a really good system for like the editor being like, wink, wink, like, not a lot's going to happen in-house. And that's why you have to read the tea leaves.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you said too makes me think about what some others have touched on earlier in this conversation too about, moving on to the next thing. That's always really helpful for writers in general. We're always happier when we actually are writing. And also thinking about, your goals as an artist and for your career. Marie, since Anjali mentioned you, would love to hear your take on this as well.
Around like what to expect in that first year.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think that thinking about you have that 3 month-ish window where you have to have like a lot of like active, focused energy from the marketer and the publicist around your book, where there's pitching and like even if the publicist is getting rejection after rejection, they're still trying to pitch you. They're still trying to like clawing their way through the noise, trying to make space. But eventually, I think if like you're in a scenario where for whatever reason, whether it's timing, whether it's competition, whether like some other like crazy headline has dropped and is like sucking up all the oxygen in the media landscape. Um, if you're in a situation where like a book isn't gaining traction, either among media and usually that means like it's affecting the discoverability of the book. It's making it hard so that readers know that a book is out there and ready to be bought and read and loved. Then yeah, I think the publicist, marketer, they have to move on because they're working on I don't know exactly how many books they work on a month, but it's a lot. It's more than editors are working on for sure. If I say I worked on 8 to 10 books a year, I think easily the publicists and marketers are probably working on that on like 3 times that. So I will add, I think one thing that I want to mention here, and it's still, I don't know, I think this is going around. I think this is becoming more and more of like an accepted of a narrative that's going around and like an understanding of the publishing landscape. But I think in the past, things are shifting, I think, in terms of how books are discovered, the kind of shape of a publication timeline. I mean, it I've only been in the industry for about 10 years, and even I am sensing a kind of radical shift, I think, in terms of like the timeline to success, timeline to being discovered that a book is experiencing, where it used to be, um, oh, someone put this in a really smart way that I'm not going to remember how to say it, but it used to be that publishers used to be able to tell the market, this is the big book, you must buy it. And they used to be able to do that because they had a lot more power over distribution. They used to do that because retailers used to dedicate a lot more space to books, and distribution, visibility often ended up in like translated to book sales. Right now, I touched on this already in this conversation, but we are in a much more kind of consumer-driven economy where publishers almost have to we're not as much the kind of trendsetters, I think, as we once were in the past. And I'm speaking largely, I think, again, from a big five capacity where like these publishers really did used to enjoy that power of like telling people this is the book of the season. Now we're a lot more kind of dependent on like this kind of fractured like media and consumer landscape to kind of tell us like, okay, actually, so you published like these books in this season. This is actually the one we want. Give us more of this. So I say that because for a writer, for that question of like, okay, I published a book, what can I expect in that first year? I think what you can expect is like uh, one of these scenarios where like maybe like yeah, maybe you get those 3 months from a publicist and like they have a hard with a dedicated marketer and publicist, but they're unable to gain traction, and then you have to move on to the next project and like learn to like find a way to learn from that process, from that experience. Or you might this is becoming also a common story where a book has a very quiet first 3 months, and then through the kind of organic word of mouth, TikTok does something. I think we're still trying to figure out how TikTok works, but TikTok does something. And then suddenly, like before you know it, like you're the talk of the town. I think this is what happened to The Correspondent. It wasn't a TikTok book, but it was a kind of steady word of mouth book that like published earlier this year and then just like steadily became like the biggest book, biggest novel of the year by the end. So that's maybe a frustrating answer to just say, but I think like it used to be if you didn't find success within that first 3 months, then the publisher has to move on to something. But I think we're like moving into this landscape now where because readers and consumers are telling publishers, they are empowered to tell publishers what they want to read, the possibilities of like finding success further down the road
Yeah. And
is becoming like more and more likely.
And I think success is also like relative, right? This is another reason why, if you're a poet and you sell 3,000 copies and you're in a small press, that can be a very successful publication. And if you're a poet and you sell 3,000 copies at a big five, the numbers are small, right? Like the space that you're in is also part of what defines success. I was going to say there's like the success of I got a big review that again, those used to drive sales. A big New York, getting the cover of the New York Times used to act magazine, book reviews to drive sales. It really truly is like, oh, that was nice. But like it doesn't mean anything in terms of numbers. But the long tail can also be the award nominations, winning the awards, course adoptions, right? Professors starting to teach your book over time. That is like long, low, steady sales. And that tends to grow because professors also talk to each other. So like um, you may not be at Costco, but you have found like you've managed to figure out your readers and also continue to sell books in a steady way, even without having been on Terry Gross or like been anointed by big media.
Thank you both for that perspective. Neela, I saw you nodding. Would you want to jump in on this question as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it like they said, it's so hard to know where to go. Um, or like what is leading people. So again, it's really I just think that like I mean I've seen obviously as a small press, I'm much more familiar with that kind of collaborative process where if somebody is really excited and they're like, I'm going to set up all these events, like I will for sure, and they're leading that, I will do whatever I can to help them. And I have, capacity on my team, or we, at a small press over since I think, for the last 5 or 6 years over that, maybe I work with publicists when I can, and I've had situations where a author will have their own resources for that and will split it, or they'll really drive that interest and be really involved, and I'll have authors who are just like whatever whatever works. So I think it's, I mean, I think the thing with hiring a publicist is that that is hard, is that it is a crapshoot, right? Like you just don't know what's going to stick. It's harder to predict because of all these things that Marie and Anjali said, like which exactly, there's not like, okay, if we pay, $10,000 for a publicist for your book, then you're going to get X amount of publicity for it. That's just not, it's not how it works. And I've had friends who've like stopped being, publicists because it's just, they felt like they were fleecing people because, they still have to put in the same amount of time. They still have to do their job, and it's harder to know. So I think it's, I think in having as much information about that, knowing it, being able to kind of navigate it and figure things out in that way is important, but it is a little bit topsy-turvy out there right now for sure.
Well, and I also wanted to add that, like, for a big, like, if you're being published on a big five and you're working with one of those publicists, it's like 16 to 40,000 for the publicity campaign. Which is why when you get a big advance, it can make sense. But I do want to say that a lot of the literary books that you see everywhere are books where where there was a freelance publicist involved, right? Like, just to also say, like, don't berate your publisher, because those in-house publicists are working really hard, but it's very different the kind of resources they can put behind each book, just in terms of time. Um, and that many of the literary books that you sort of like, oh, that was there and that was there and that was there, they really did. You should see. I mean, like, it's worth fact checking. It's worth being like, oh, I saw this book everywhere. How did that happen?
Yeah, and if it's, I mean, I think in that way, I mean, if you're feeling, like being, again, adding somebody to your team, I don't think it's ever going to hurt, right? Like if you're adding a publicist, it is hard to know what's going to work, but it definitely does. It's like added, there's another person on your team who's really helping you, especially if you're coming from a different industry entirely and you're like, I want to put on events because there's this horrible New York thing where like nobody sends their authors to LA. So like I know so many, I help so many people with events in New York, and so many LA publicists help people with LA events because, it's just not on the circuit, but like LA is a very literary city and there's a lot going on here. So, like if you're like, what, my book is set in California, but I live in Pennsylvania and I want to set up these events. There's a lot of people out here willing to help you. And I think it would be frustrating I've had friends who are at other small presses that they don't do any events. I have friends who are like mid-list at big presses who are like, I need help. So, I think it goes both ways, and there's a lot of people out there that you can collaborate with. If you don't have an agent, if I think again, like being able to put some of that energy, and there's so many ways to do it. There's ways to do it with like, I'm just going to set up, events and drive around, and it's find bookstores and, stay on people's couches. It's not like always, it doesn't necessarily mean like I'm going to spend, $40,000 on it. I think there's ways to do it and get the word out and, do that research yourself too. But there are people who can help. And I think there's a lot of freelance publicists who also have tiers too, like, oh, I can give you a consultation, oh, I can, share a list with you for this much. So I think and that, but the main thing is, I think for myself and for all of you, you're on this call, you're motivated. It would probably, once the book is done and you're like, how can I do it? Like having, wanting to be like, I'm gonna go to all the libraries in my town and make sure that they like have the book. Like it's so small. You can do so many things just to like in your networks to make sure your book is getting out there. And I think that really starts to it makes a difference, I think. And I get, I have some friends who've published with small presses and they get really pouty. They're like, no, they didn't do anything for me. And I'm like, I know, but now you have a book, you have an ISBN, it's out there. Like they did an amazing thing and your book is amazing. And now like I really try to coach people not to get into that feeling, which is it's tough. And I think that I'm sure, Anjali is here for that too. Like to have an agent, to have a community be like, yeah, that was frustrating. It is frustrating because you then see people who are in a different situation and are getting, a tour or getting bigger events or getting more publicity. But, and I really try to tell people like that number. Like if you're getting published by a small press and they're just not going to do publicity for you, you need to know that you need to be thinking about it 3 to 6 months before if you can. If you can. That's a good number for 4 to 6 months. If ask those questions if you're with a small press, or if you have a sense like Anjali was saying from that publicity meeting, then you can kind of be like, all right, that's when you need to be doing it. It's really hard to do anything, I would say, media wise after the book is already published. So that's one real tip that if you're trying to do stuff, I mean, there are legs afterwards, especially with course adoptions and events. But if you're trying to make a little bit of a splash media wise, you really want to be pushing in advance of the publication date.
Thank you so much. This was incredible. I can't believe we're already at the end of our event. There were so many amazing questions, but thank you everyone who asked questions and submitted them to our Q&A. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And thank you, of course, to our wonderful, incredible panelists. We'll be sending out a recording of this event within the next few weeks or so. And we're very excited to hopefully bring new events to you later on this year or next. Thank you all so much for coming and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the great moderation, Gina.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.